Hello and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab talk. My name is Sarah Wallison. I'm the director of the lab. It is my great pleasure to introduce Raney Aronson-Rath, executive producer of Frontline, PBS's flagship investigative journalism series. She's a leading voice on the future of journalism and an alumni of our lab's fellowship program. She was one of our first. Raney oversees Frontline's reporting on air and online and directs the series' editorial vision, executive producing over 20 documentaries each year. She's also created noteworthy initiatives, including a local news initiative, the Transparency Project, and formed partnerships with organizations such as the Marshall Project and the New York Times. Under Raney's leadership, not only has Frontline garnered Oscars and Emmys and Peabodys for its investigative journalism, but also for its innovative approach to storytelling. In June, Frontline won the prestigious Institutional Peabody Award. The jurors noted that under Aronson-Rath's leadership, the organization has not only thrived by continuing its robust output of films with even greater diversity of filmmakers, but also expanded its reporting and distribution channels by venturing boldly into the digital era. Raney is notable for her bold approach to innovation while ensuring excellence in reporting, uncovering vital stories in new ways, it says on the Frontline website. Today, Raney will talk about the culture of innovation at Frontline and what it means for a national investigative journalism organization to be innovating in a disrupted media landscape. Before I pass it over to Raney, I just want to remind people to put your questions in the Q&A. We'll have a robust Q&A section at the end of her talk. And without further ado, Raney Aronson-Rath.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here, and what a wonderful event and forum for me to talk about our innovation. And I mean, it feels like coming back to home because, of course, a lot of my thinking really started at the Doc Lab. And I really can't tell Sarah and Charles enough, and so many people, William, how appreciative I am to being able to be a fellow during, actually it was 6 years ago now, so it feels like a long time ago for me, but also just a short time ago. So I actually wanted to start personal because I think it's really important for you all to know where innovation really took hold with me as a person, and then how it translated to Frontline. So I'm a mother. I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and my daughter, Mira, 10 years ago was very speech delayed. And so we started to think about how we could reach Mira in a way that would be innovative. And we were working with a speech therapist who was a young woman, a really wonderful young woman who was coming into our home 3 mornings a week before I went to work. And she one day mentioned to me the iPad, and it was the first generation iPad, in fact. And I said, sure, why don't we try it? And of course, my husband and I, who's Arun Roth, and I were thinking, you know, we really didn't want to introduce media so early in Mira's life, but we really decided it was important to see if this was a way to unlock language for Mira. And so we started to work with the speech therapist and the first generation iPad. And what we noticed right away with Mira is how immersed she was, and how this was her first media experience, how incredibly nimble she was. She was able to go into this iPad like it was her best friend. She could touch it, she could move it around. And it was really within the first session that we started to see words and sounds were starting to tumble out of Mira in a way that we really didn't expect. And so we really started to study Mira with the speech therapist and say, like, well, what is this form? You know, what is this nonlinear form that is so immersive? And Arun and I actually really got into the iPad ourselves right away and started to think, well, like, how does this actually translate to the work that we do in journalism? Arun is also a journalist. He's a radio journalist, and I'm a television journalist. So the two of us had this very robust discussion. But it really didn't take off until, yet again, Mira had a big epiphany in our living room, and it was the television set. And her second experience with media was actually watching TV. And she didn't do that until she was a little bit over the age of 2. And we put it on the big screen, and Mira started to want to touch the big screen. So remember, the iPad's her first experience. So it's a very natural thing that she would want to touch the screen. And again, this is about 9 or 10 years ago, and we had to tell her not to touch it. And we had to tell her this because she was a 2-year-old multiple times. She started to throw an absolute tantrum in my living room. And it was really like a moment where I was watching my own daughter throw a tantrum and then realizing something really important. You know, television to her, this lean back experience of just watching something, was not natural at all to her. She thought we were crazy for telling her no. And for me, as both a parent, but also as a filmmaker myself, I was watching her actually defy the linear form. And it was in that moment that I realized, you know, I need to pay attention to this reaction that she's having, and also share it with my colleagues at Frontline. So what I'm going to launch into is a talk about Frontline, but really it started in my own living room with Mira really telling me like this was not okay, that she couldn't touch and feel and experience and immerse herself in the screen. Of course, she did get used to TV down the road, but we decided at that moment really to hold back television and give her a much more, you know, authentic experience for her, which was the interactive nature of an iPad and then devices as she grew older that really allowed her the ability to actually interact and be involved with her media. So that moment happened. I went into the newsroom and at the time had an incredible digital leader named Andrew Golis, who was my partner in crime on all things innovative. And I told him my experience, and he had a look of relief on his face. And it was almost as if he said, thank God, you know, Raney gets it now, that we really do need to start to think about what is the Frontline of the future? And actually, what is Frontline going to be? Is it going to be a TV show? Is it going to be a digital property? Is it going to have interactive form to it? And should we be, as journalists in the space that is interactive filmmaking, but also interactive storytelling? We certainly didn't know what we were going to make at that point, but we knew that we had to be in this important space. And I think, you know, I can't really speak to how profound that moment was, other than to say that it was like a light bulb moment for me and the start of a real journey for me that I feel like today I'm still really in the middle of. I certainly don't think we have it figured out at Frontline, and I'm going to talk to you about a few of our big projects, but certainly it was the beginning of something that became a real passion of mine, which is to say, linear filmmaking, yes, of course, that is Frontline, but what more can we do? And how can we reach younger generations and new generations in a way that feels authentic to them? So the next step on my journey is the Open Doc Lab. And it was a conversation I had with William and with Sarah about really where I hope to go with the future of Frontline, but also my own storytelling. And that I really felt at Frontline, in order to authentically lead, I had to actually learn more. I couldn't just do it intuitively. I had to actually study what was going on in the interactive world and to be surrounded by people who were trying to push the envelope in story terms. And so I convinced them to let me be a fellow. And actually, you know, I'm surprised looking back that they said yes, but I was one of the first fellows, and it was a remarkable experience. I will say humbling as well. And I know a bunch of fellows have joined me today, and it's really going to be wonderful to hear your questions, because the fellowship to me was really everything and helped me with my education, but also with my owning myself and my own where I was at the time, which was actually very humbling. So I can remember very early sitting around the table at MIT with multiple people who are already working in the space of interactive storytelling, asking me so many questions about what Frontline should be doing and not having the answer. I was really at the beginning of my journey. I do want to say that the only reason I knew about the Open Doc Lab was because of Kathy M., who of course is a really amazing leader in the journalism space at MacArthur. And the two of us did the fellowship together that year. And the conversation I had with Kathy and with Sarah and with William and many others, you know, really, really profoundly changed my life, both professionally and for Frontline as well. So I'm going to share my screen now and launch into a more formal talk about where Frontline's been and where we're going. And I really can't wait for your questions. It's my favorite part of all of these talks, is really hearing from the audience, hearing what's on your mind, and also just being engaged in a dialogue that, you know, hopefully educates me as well. Before I do that, I have one more anecdote to share, and really tells you how much the Open Doc Lab, you know, did for me personally and professionally. Is at the end of the year, I was asked to moderate a lecture at MIT, and there were a few people on the panel, and I was the moderator. And I decided to invite my son, and I mentioned him in the beginning. He's 14 now, but at the time he was 6 years ago, so he was much younger. But he is also, very, very involved with playing Minecraft and other gaming. Really loved to game and was really excited to come and to learn about what MIT was all about. And somebody on the panel was from Oculus, so he's very interested in coming. So he came, and he was 8, so he's little. He sat right in the front row. And at the very end of the talk and the lecture and also the panel discussion, there was a little more time, so he raised his hand. And any of you are parents, or if you know kids, I had a lot of trepidation actually calling on my son in front of, a couple of hundred people, students and faculty at MIT, but I decided it was okay. And I called on Arjun, and he asked me a simple question, that took me really off guard. And he said to me, "Mom, why can't Frontline be more like Minecraft?" And I honestly felt really embarrassed because I thought it was a silly question still. I really, really hadn't leapt yet. And then I realized the entire crowd was clapping and so supportive of Arjun's question. And, for me as both a parent and also a producer, it was another moment where my children were showing me the path forward, not the Frontline's Minecraft, of course, but certainly Frontline has, dived into more of a virtual space, into a space where you can experience it in a more 3D perspective. And, these moments along the way have really taught me a lot. So I'm going to launch into this now. And again, I really welcome your questions. So just give me one moment as I share my screen. So I want to just start with what's Frontline. I mean, Frontline is, of course, what we make it to be. And there was always this amazing perspective that I had as I was growing in my leadership, which is that the people who run Frontline are Frontline, right? But then the people who make Frontline are really the heart and soul of what we do. And, on screen are just these images from so many of our films. And I have to say, the filmmakers, the interactive storytellers, the reporters, those are the people who really make Frontline. And my job is to really work with them and to make their work better, really. And it's the job of an editor, but it's also the job of somebody who is giving people license to have authorship over their own work and helping them along the way. That's really how I see my work now. And I've really embraced my role, but also the role of encouraging innovation in the public media space, innovation in the journalism space. Those two things are very, very important to me. So we think about Frontline now on so many different forms. Of course, we have our documentary series, and we're really, really fortunate that every year we produce 20 to 26 documentaries, which is a lot. It basically means in my life, and you can imagine what that's meant in the current affairs space in the last number of years, that means almost every other week we're finishing a new film. These documentaries range from traditionally told films that are narrated with our narrator, all the way to a film like For Sama, which was Oscar nominated, and also just so beautifully told from a mother's perspective about what it was like to live in Syria. And of course, the For Sama film was special because, we had done so many journalistic films before that, and Syria is one of my biggest passions. But the way that she was able to, I really believe, break through barriers and get people to pay attention to Syria was extraordinary. And I think it's because she told it with her own voice, and she really shared the experience on a personal level. And we were able to then work with her, and she really wanted to do this, to share also the journalism that she was documenting along the way. Frontline's, found in so many different devices now. And what we're talking about today is more of the interactive space, but I do want to point out that, it is really, like, from my perspective as a person who runs Frontline, it really is about thinking holistically about Frontline and thinking about something that I've written a lot about and I've thought a lot about, which is, what is the right forum for a story? So I can give you so many examples where something started out thinking, the producers thought it was going to be a linear film, but then ultimately we decided it should be an interactive film, or something that's digital or text becomes a film. So the other way that we're really experimenting now is in audio. And I think that's a terrain that Frontline is just beginning in, which is some of these investigations are best told in audio. So for me, it really starts with what is the right forum for the journalism and how do we reach new people? So those two ideas go hand in hand for me. I really care about reaching the next generation of people where they are and how they actually experience and interact with media. And that means, and we'll talk about this later as well, really reaching people on their platforms like YouTube. And we increasingly are sharing our films on YouTube, and we're seeing audiences there, sometimes in the multi-millions. And people on those, those platforms are sharing with us how important it is to have this kind of journalism in their environment. So not expecting people, and I think this is really a mindset change, to find you on the dial or to find PBS even, or to even know about Frontline, but rather to say, we have to lean in and help them find us. And that's been a really important part of the work that I do and that I care deeply about. So our work really begins actually again with the Open Doc Lab. So one of the things that William and Sarah talked to us all about as fellows is choosing actually a story that we would tell or a project. And because I was working at the number 2 of Frontline at the time, I decided to approach one of our filmmakers, Dan Edge, who is one of my favorite filmmakers of all time, has done so many beautiful films for us in linear form, and to ask him, when he was doing a really important film for us on the Ebola outbreak, if he would work with me on a 3D film. So this was one of these 360 films that we felt like was very much at the beginning of this story form. So this is many, many years ago. So if you watch it now, you would say, oh, that's really a rudimentary experiment. But for us to have Dan, first of all, say he was willing to do it and shoot this in addition to making a linear film was the first step. And the second step was us actually working together when he came back, and how much we learned was remarkable. It was really like we leapt off a cliff, and we look back at that really fondly. And I'm sure all of you have had this moment too, where, it's really about what are you making? We're just makers really at the end of the day. And certainly my career before running Frontline was making multiple films. And so I think we come at it with that perspective. You can talk about innovation, you can say you want a bigger audience, but really at the end of the day, you have to start making the work and learning about it and then figuring out what you did wrong. So I felt like the Ebola first crack at this was one of the best things that we ever did. After that moment, we actually did about 4 or 5 other experiences in the 360 space, and we learned a lot. And one of the things I want to talk about, and I'm going to continue to talk about, is the people that are behind these projects. One of the things I noticed very early when we were doing this work is how many new people were at the table. So one of the projects we did, for example, with Secret Location, who really taught us a lot as well, a Toronto-based company, was this idea that we had, so many different types of people with expertise around a table thinking and talking together. That's a very, typical thing for a film team, but I was really familiar with who were the players on a film team. So for me to be with people who were gamers, people who knew how to do really sophisticated animation work, and people who knew how to take the reality or the dream of what we wanted and make it into a reality was wonderful. And it was really something that I look back on thinking like, wow, from the Frontline perspective, we were not that sophisticated. But again, because we were working with people who were, and real leaders in this space, I think we were able to leap ahead much more quickly. There were also, very important to mention, a couple of people on the Frontline team who the Open Doc Lab is pretty familiar with, who really embraced this with me. And I can't even say how appreciative I am that, a bunch of people got the bug with me, and so I can't do everything myself. In fact, I really do run the whole series. So there is a group of people at Frontline who have been really, really thoughtful, and they're leading the charge now for Frontline, which is really exciting for me. So that's Carla Boras, Michelle Meisner, who's spoken before to the Open Doc Lab, and Dan Nolan, who is our designer, who is amazing. And many other people on the journalism side, but I feel like those 3 have really been so committed to working with me and coming up with new ideas and pitching us ideas that really then stick, and then really doing the hard work and making this work happen. So these are some screenshots just of this work. I wish I could show it to you all. And if anyone wants links to any of this work, or we can certainly show you, you know, any of this work, we'd love to, because it's a lot and it's a PowerPoint instead of actually experiencing it. So it's a little counterintuitive to see screen grabs in a talk like this. So I wanted to talk about this film because this was one of the most interesting ones that we did. I think it's important to note that this was in collaboration with NPR as well. And we really started to think through how we could storyboard. I think it was one of the more successful early experiments for us. Also, we got a lot of attention for this, which really helped us as well. This is work we did, as I mentioned, with Secret Location. And they were really one of our first collaborators that I felt really was able to translate, you know, the idea of journalism, but then really talk to us about like how we could tell this story. Again, you know, coming from a linear filmmaking perspective, it was, I wouldn't say it was always like easy for me to like leap in this way. And I also found myself really having to scale back the amount of information that you can put in these environments, which was frustrating to me, especially in these types of environments, which is one reason, and we're going to get to these projects soon, that we really have moved into a different space, into an interactive space, so that we can embed more journalism in it. At the end of the day, you know, Frontline is a journalism organization, and I care deeply about ideas and nuance and depth being added into this environment. So some of these early experiments, we had to take a lot of information out that, you know, was hard on someone like me as a storyteller, but I feel was really righteous because it helped us understand more about like where we could go with this forum and what some of the tensions were with us as a news organization. Here are some shots from inside the experience. Some of the most memorable work that we did on the early side of our innovation. I think when I talk about my team, one of the things that really I can't underscore is this sort of culture of what we've cultivated, and it doesn't happen overnight. I think this idea that a legacy news organization that has a tradition that is a really well-known tradition of linear, very influential and very serious documentary, moving into new spaces could not have happened, and I really need to emphasize this, without the vision, early vision of David Fanning, who is our founder, who always had this excitement in the air about how we could tell stories in a different way. And I think that's always been at the heart of Frontline. And so when I was really joining the leadership and joining with my own vision, you know, I wasn't obstructed. And this is what I try to now do for my staff, you know, is make sure they don't feel obstructed in their ideas. So one of the things that happens in news organizations and in other organizations, I'm sure, is that there's a sort of set idea of what the organization is, especially a successful one. And so the idea that you might tinker with that, or you might jump off a cliff and do something different, is actually quite scary for leadership, right? Especially when you've been successful. So the fact that I was able to really go to the Open Doc Lab, start some of these experiments before even taking over Frontline, really set me up for success in a cultural sense, right? And that's why I labeled this the way I did, because I do believe that we all have it in us to innovate if you're inclined to, right? But the question is, do you have the space to, and do you have the permission to, from the people who are your bosses, or the people who are paying for your work, or whatever it is, whatever arrangement you have, you know, do you have that space? So one of the things I did early on was really think about, you know, structural change in addition to cultural change. So a lot of that times, especially in the public media space, but in any space truly, is you need to have funding for these ideas. So it doesn't just come out of the goodwill of people. It doesn't just come out of like the air that this work happens. It really has to be thought through, has to be a good idea, but then it needs to be funded. So one of the early parts of how we've been thinking about this is, how do we sustain this work financially? And I've talked to many people about this in the interactive space. One of the hardest things to do actually in the innovation space, especially when it comes to non-commercial work, is how do you pay for it, and how do you actually continue that work. So you do like a one-off, but then how do you keep doing that work? And that takes funding. So I wanted to stop on this slide just for a little bit, because this is, our first substantial grant came from the Knight Foundation. Again, what they were interested in is how is Frontline going to innovate beyond the linear form? And so they were actually quite taken with this idea. And we had a great partner in a big film that we did together, a big VR film with Nana de la Pena, who is really, of course, you all know who she is, but my experience with Nani was one of a kind. I would say that first of all, she's a journalist too, which is, extremely helpful. So we share a language on, what we could do in a VR space and how responsible we had to be. And also, I think we both were really moved by the idea of how do we take people virtually to Greenland so they can actually see Greenland melting. It's like the climate change issue now, people are really starting to report on it. But then, which is just a few years ago, it was very hard to get traction for these ideas around, climate change is real, it's happening in front of us, and how are you going to be able to experience it? So I feel very passionate that a linear film would not do the Greenland story justice, and I think I was proven right. The experience was hard. I would say that we found, multiple times, we had hiccups along the way. Things are more expensive than you'd ever hope for. And then we would just have to recalibrate our ambition and then figure out, okay, like, how are we going to do this? Because we didn't have limitless money. But I think at the end of the day, what was amazing is that we were able to pull off something that was really an incredible experience. I do wish it had a bigger reach. We were frustrated we couldn't get this into more communities, and that we didn't have funding to really have the impact that we wanted. But I do think for what we could do, we got it in as many places as possible. And it really was profound for us, and I think for the people who saw it. The other really important thing that I found, and of course I was in the Open Doc Lab, so I was privy to all of the innovative work happening in this space, but most people aren't. And something like Greenland melting actually opened the idea for people that are stakeholders. So, I could talk about the person who led the WGBH board at the time. I could talk about the president of GBH, John Abbott, all of these people seeing it. All of a sudden it was like they believed it. And so that's another big part of the work that we do is evangelizing that this is important for journalism and public media too. And the only way you can do that, I've realized time and time again, is by actually showing that telling, right? And we talk about that in storytelling a lot. Just show me something, don't just talk to me. But especially in this space where people are not familiar with the form, showing it is everything. And so it's been an experience to make sure that the people who lead the institutions that support Frontline understand what we're doing and then really believe in it. So we've done a number of other really amazing pieces of work, but why I wanted to focus on inheritance was, this is Michelle Meisner's incredible work where she took the findings of this incredible story. I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly than I thought of to this slide, which is a box for Ken Dorenstein's brother who was killed in the Pan Am, really terrible bombing. And he was doing a big film series for us, but what he found was a box that had a lot of his brother David's, things once he crashed, and they found these amazing artifacts. And what Michelle decided to do is to do an interactive experience inside a box. And it was the first time that I had seen the potential of working, and this is a web-based experience, with a web-based experience that you could really layer journalism into. So it was more than just the box. This was about my expansive ideas out of Michelle's work about where Frontline could go and then how we could reach more people. So why I'm sharing this is because just culturally, it's important that this was a moment for us at Frontline where we thought, okay, this is something we can sustain, web-based interactive work. We can sustain more easily than a really big film like the VR Greenland melting film. But also it's not an either or. We could do this type of work and we can continue in VR. But this really opened my eyes to the possibilities ahead of us, which we've now experimented with multiple times. So here are some images from that experience. And this is something we can easily share. And I really would love for you all to experience this. Again, it'll feel a few years old because it is, but you'll see why this could inspire someone like me who is a filmmaker, but really we started to embrace this idea of the multitude of artifacts, the multitude of layers, and how one might experience our journalism and our findings in a way that's less linear. So that really led us to our next project. Again, because of time, I won't go into too much detail about this, but I will say that The Last Generation is our next big exploration in climate change. And it started in a way that's really very specific to Frontline's process now, which is that, again, Michelle and a colleague of hers, Katie Worth, were really passionate about what was happening vis-a-vis climate change in the Marshall Islands. And they decided to go. This is when we could all travel and film. And so they went to the Marshall Islands and they filmed with these extraordinary young people who live on the Marshall Islands. And the idea was, let's talk to the last generation of people who are living on the Marshall Islands, knowing that climate change is really enveloping their island. So this had been done in print and in text. We felt there was a film there, so they came back with these remarkable portraits, these remarkable children. And actually, we have done a couple of films that are based in children's stories, like The Children of Syria. So we're really interested in sharing stories that are told from so many different perspectives, but also the child's perspective is so important to hear. And in this particular case, very, very important. And so we watched this in a linear edit room. They spent a lot of time putting together a rough cut for me. And I was there, and Carla was there, and Michelle was there, and the editor, who was remarkable. And we watched it, and we realized that, you know, for the linear form, the children were remarkable, but actually what would be even better is if we could take their stories and then we could embed the intellectual work that really would convince people of what was happening in climate terms. So it was one thing to hear their stories and to be touched by them. It's another thing to educate and then to activate impact, right? And the only way that we know how to do that is with investigative journalism and journalism that surrounds these character portraits. So we decided the best form for that, rather than putting a bunch of experts in a documentary, was the interactive form. And so I said this, we talked about it, and Michelle completely embraced it and came back. You know, of course, we had to delay the project. It was like another year, but we really, really believed in the idea that this was something that could be even more thoughtful, that could be more impactful. And we worked really hard on this project. These are the three incredible characters who really are the voices of the project. And inside it, we embed journalism, and it's really an interesting interactive. It's really like an interactive that's led by video as opposed to an interactive that's led by text. So that's the sort of inverse experiment that we did here. I'm really proud of this work in particular. I'm proud of it for a million reasons, but one of the most important reasons is we worked with our designer, Dan Nolan, on this, and I really feel like he brought it to the next level of an experience. And one of our designers as well, we worked with, who was on the outside, who was just incredible as well. The other thing, the reason I'm so passionate about public media and just education in general is that, you know, what I think really sets us apart is that this work then makes it into the classrooms. And Frontline has, in all of public media series, actually, we have this incredible penetration into the public school systems in America. We're in about 65% of all public schools, which is really incredible if you think about it. And these web-based experiences are easier to share. So we had a couple of advisors from the 6th grade classroom who are teaching climate and science come in and test this with us and work with us on it. But then we also worked with our education team to make sure that this was something that classrooms would use. And, you know, out of the blue one day I came home and my son had been assigned this. I mean, it's probably also because I run Frontline that they knew about it. But the point is they were able to share it with him, and he didn't even realize it was really a Frontline, and was completely blown away by this experience. So again, the idea of giving someone his age, he was 12 at the time, the ability to go at his own pace, read at his own pace, explore at his own pace, and to really engage with the characters that resonated more with him. The character that resonated with my son was this character, and to this day, he asked me about him, and we keep in touch with those kids. They're incredible children. So the other thing that happened with this, again, with the idea of really helping our stakeholders understand what we're doing, is it did win a ton of awards, but the most significant one is that it won the World Press Photo Award, which was the first one for interactive work. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on that. I think it was either the first year or maybe the second year. And what that meant, and again, because we're public media and our funding isn't finite, you know, we is not, you know, we're not able to, it is finite in the sense that we're not able to bring it all around the world. What the World Press Photo did was actually take our interactive, and it was exhibited all around the world. And for us to have our work in the world is everything. And the feedback we got was remarkable. So success begets success. It's the other thing about innovation. Very helpful when projects are seen, they're experienced, people are moved by them, people share them, and then they're supported by other organizations that bring them into the world. So this was terrific. And of course, it was in a multitude of classrooms, as I mentioned, and something that we really care about is making sure that the media that, you know, kids at the middle school and high school level are experiencing really resonates with them. We do know in college, for example, our linear films are used all the time. But I felt like this was really crucial for, you know, children who are starting to learn about the gravity of climate change. And this was a real life example where they could really start to see like, okay, this is real, and this is what it's like for people my age to experience it. Of course, since then, fires, storms, everything has started to become much more real in many of our lives. So I want to talk very quickly before I open this up to questions about a very special and probably most ambitious project we've ever undertaken. And I'm not going to talk at length about this, but I do want to talk in part about this. And again, it comes back to Carla and Michelle and this innovation team who pitched me and Andrew Metz, our managing editor, on what they thought would be an incredible actually serialized documentary series, so a multi-part documentary series on the stories of the civil rights era cold cases. There's a list that's a really important list of cases that were opened again, and many of which had been closed. And so what they really wanted to do is to tell the stories of the families who are waiting for justice of these cases, but also to ask tough questions. And you know what Frontline does often, not in all of our films, but I would say in about 90% of our films, is really focus on the accountability journalism of the stories that we're telling. So in this case, they really wanted us to, you know, make sure that we were holding the Department of Justice and the FBI to account. So they pitched it as a documentary series, and because there's 151 cases, it was very hard for us to actually think about which cases we would choose for like even a 4 or 6 part series. So what we decided to do instead was a very ambitious interactive that actually is one of the first times all of these cases have been put together in one place. Now these are, of course, the most famous of which is Emmett Till, but there's so many stories here of alleged murders during the civil rights era that we felt that we couldn't just tell one story and not the other. So we've been working together with a number of other news organizations and people to help us do this. This is now almost 1.5 years in the making. And I just want to share with you that this is now how we think at Frontline. So you have the project, but these are the different ideas that go with it. Beyond the podcast, we're also working in a space that we've never worked in before, but many of you have, which is the installation space. And this will be obviously a post-COVID idea, but we're now really thinking about how we can bring this journalism project, this beautiful interactive and investigation into the public. And we're starting thinking about the installation at the beginning. And of course, we're always thinking about how this then goes into, you know, it's a web-based experience, as you can see on the screen. It's a podcast, it's an installation, but also there's a curriculum that goes with it. And I just want to share a screen of our team. The team is really, really multifaceted. As you can see, our creative director is from Otto, and you guys are familiar with her work. What I'm hoping is that she will come and talk about this project, because this is really her idea. And one of the things that we've really learned about Tamara and so many others who work in this space is we can bring the journalism idea, and we have a lot of ideas. We have ideas on how we could tell stories, but I think that the key is being open to what someone like her brings to the table. So what she brought to us is the design of how we might work with the names and the stories in a way that I could have never imagined. I mean, I really, truly, authentically mean that. And that's when my job gets really exciting. I certainly don't have all the answers. And I think, again, with the idea being that, giving space to brilliant people who have these incredible creative visions is something that really is the best part of what I do. And I also want to point out Don Porter, who is the executive producer of this. This project has become so big that, of course, I do executive produce all of Frontline, but I really needed a partner to oversee this project and to lead it. So it's really Tamara and Don's vision, working with, of course, the people I've talked with so much about, which is Carla and Michelle and so many others that you see here. Again, I wanted to add on this because when you really think about it, right, in the innovation space and creating an innovation culture, it's the people who do the work, right? It's somebody like James Edward who's leading the reporting on the podcast, or it's someone like Dan who's an incredible designer. And of course, it's also all the journalists who are behind this important work and the editors. So something we really believe at Frontline is, every single thing, whether it's an interactive, a podcast, it's a film, goes through the same exact vetting process that our documentary films do, and always have. So this will be scrutinized, this will be edited, and that's really our job at Frontline, is to bring that level of expertise to the table. And so these are our partners. I mean, really, we're so blessed. Otto, of course, is Tamara's amazing company, but also we're working with StoryCorps for the first time. And, David Ize and Robin, who run StoryCorps, and I've talked at long time about what we could do together. And what they're doing is helping us really collect the stories of the next of kin. That's really their expertise. So having that expertise at the table is critical to the success also of the interactive, but also the podcast. Black public media is crucial. And of course, Northeastern University, they're the ones who've actually collected a lot of this data on these cases and have really led the charge. So we're really blessed to be working with them. And the next talk I hope that comes out of the world of Frontline will be this team talking about this remarkable project. And this is really our guiding light for that project. And I think that is probably a lot of our guiding light, and also making sure that the work that we do has, social justice right at the heart of it, so that it has the biggest impact that it can have. And that is my talk, but I really can't wait to hear all of your questions. I'm gonna stop sharing, and I really can't wait to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you, Raney. That was amazing. Such a wonderful explanation of what it takes to innovate, in a legacy organization, and to bring such depth to it. And the paradigm shift of, television is not necessarily natural, and asking that question of what form the story should take. So really interesting, that cultural shift and the structural shift. So I'm going to open up to questions. We have all of our fellows here, and I want to see if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask Raney. I see William has his mute off, so William, why don't you take it?
Raney, first of all, thank you so much for being here, for the amazing work, for this latest project, Unresolved. We'll talk later about, there's a lot to talk about. It's amazing. And I guess I have an environmental question.
Right.
So you've really done a wonderful job of explaining how you came to see this the way you do, the plurality of platforms, to meet the needs of a plurality of audiences. When we talk about public media, we still largely mean broadcast. We still, carried through the cable, but we still think of spectrum. In places like the Netherlands, there are moves afoot to try to make public media inhabit a space online, to try to carve out a space of the internet for the public. What do you think about that? Do you think, is there a way
I
to
think
build a
it's
space?
crucial. I think Kat could probably talk to this better. I think Canada's the model, right? So, I mean, I believe that America should be, saying there should be public media dedicated to the innovation space. Why should it be owned by commercial entities? Why should commercial be at the center of this type of innovation? I mean, I believe this about journalism too. I can tell you running Frontline that we do accountability every single day. No one has ever reached into our reporting. We are completely free of corporate sponsorship at this point, right? Like, we are able to report on corporations without harm. We really are free to do very bold investigative work. So I believe it should translate into the innovation world in space. And I think our voice should be heard. Nonprofit journalism should be heard. That idea, right? The journalism can exist without a commercial impediment. I believe it's an impediment. Should be in this world as well. That's why I feel such a calling for this, is because there isn't a lot of this happening in public media. The reason for that is funding, to be honest. It's not that there isn't a will, but it is about really, somebody in my position, we have to fundraise to make this work happen. So you have to be really, really passionate about it. It's not like somebody's paying you to do this. You have to be the one to go and do it. So that's the structural challenge for us. So I wish you well in the Netherlands. And I do look to Canada as my model. And that Kat and her work and all of the work that happens there is phenomenal. And we've studied it.
Thanks.
Halsey, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Raney. Amazing, so great, and so nice to remember our days 6 years ago, sitting at that hallway table, discussing lots of things.
Wow.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit how you think about sort of some of the technical sort of challenges in terms of accessibility and durability of these projects. Obviously, films are, easier to sort of have a long life, and some of these, as you noted, some of the projects, Inheritance and others, they look old because they are old, and soon, Flash player goes away, and all these kind of technical rot things happen that are problematic over time. And then even right when you release something, there's all these issues of accessibility and what kind of equipment you need in order to experience the pieces, and that there's obviously socioeconomic aspects of that and everything. And in my work, I do a lot with similar technology that has these challenges as well. And I always kind of go back and forth. Like, I want most people to be able to have it for the experience it for the longest period of time, but sometimes the affordances of that tech are not quite what give the experience that I want. And I was just wondering if you could just chat a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
I mean, I think it's great that you acknowledge the barriers, right? So I think that's why with the VR work that we did, the Greenland melting piece, we really, I think we did some really funky things in there. It was really cool, but it was a problem that I couldn't get it to the masses, right? So that did bother me. And then we didn't have the funding to bring it to the masses. So I was like, okay, well, I need to then architect something that can be seen and experienced by the masses. So that's why Last Generation was a web-based experience, right? So I mean, that is a challenge of the work that we're all doing, is that it's still catching up to accessibility. So, and especially in public media, why we rededicated to this idea is because, we want people to have access to it. But I will say, I don't regret that other work in a heartbeat because of what it taught me and what it taught my team, and how inspired we became and how much we learned. I mean, honestly, we can't even we couldn't have done anything that we're doing now without that experience. So in a way, it was our education, right? So, and that then led us to think hard about accessibility. And also, we thought Oculus would be cheaper. We thought they were promising all sorts of things, right? VR headsets were supposed to be a dime a dozen during the year that we were producing, but that didn't materialize. The other thing that we really felt was important, and this again came out of my gaming, teenager at this point, was really the idea of sharing the experience. So he was frustrated that you couldn't share, right, in a gaming sense. And so that was another challenge that we saw, is that, you know, younger people really wanted to have a collective experience. And we've seen this with the pandemic. My God, you know, I'm not a big gamer myself, but the fact that teens have been able to communicate with each other gaming is some sense of a community, as flawed as it may be to do 15 hours a day, mind you, right? So that's a problem. You know, it gave them a community. And so I think that was also lacking. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't go back to VR. It just means that for now, we're looking at more accessible formats. In terms of the technology, I think that's always going to be the case. And I would argue, because I'm really into cinematography and how we tell stories, you know, frontline stories are also changing, right? The vernacular is changing. A lot of times we don't narrate anymore, or we let the reporter themselves narrate. So linear television gets old too. We just don't think about it in the same way. You could still see it, right? So it doesn't break down, but you're looking at it like, oh, that's an artifact from like 5 years ago. That's how much we're changing, right? A Forsama film is so different than a film even that I oversaw 3 years earlier out of Syria. The idea of who should tell the stories for Frontline, how the story should be told, you know, those types of ideas, gosh, you could look back at that and say, man, that was actually quite old-fashioned, right? That was of its time. So I think we're all evolving, and I hope progressing.
Thanks, that's amazing. There might also be some...
That's a half glass full perspective.
Yeah. There might also be a sort of freedom from forever, if you will. Like, it's kind of nice maybe that some things like are not experienceable anymore, you know, because you can be more free and you don't need to worry about it being there forever. So I will turn the table over, but thank you so much, Raney.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you again. Really good to see you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Asya, you have a question.
Thank you, Raney, for that presentation. It was, I mean, I feel like I was familiar with Frontline, but I was very surprised by some of these awesome projects. Even, you know, with someone who is familiar with your documentaries, like I didn't know about how much interactive stuff you were doing. So I'm really excited about this new Unresolved. It seems really fascinating. And I wanted to ask you about process. You know, when your approach, how do you approach it as an investigative, you know, as an investigation? What is your process, and how is it different when you're starting on an interactive, not repurposing a documentary into interactive? When you're making an interactive instead of a linear traditional doc, how is your investigative process different, or is it?
Yeah, so I think the journalism process is the same, but I think where we've had a lot of, I don't know what the right word is, but I think like our sort of learning process is, you know this because you're an investigative reporter as well as a filmmaker, you know, investigative journalism just takes a lot of time to do right. So we might have like the interactive idea and framework and like the kind of project idea, but then the journalism is actually catching up. So that's actually kind of the inverse of filmmaking, right? Like, you know, you're a fellow, so you know what this is like. It's like you're reporting and then you're shooting along the way, right? But you kind of know what you're going for usually when you're about to launch into a film. So that process is actually should be the same for interactive work, but we are now learning it actually has to be the same. So we really need to do the journalism before we create the framework, or we even hire an interactive team, because it's really frustrating for them. They're waiting for the journalism. It's harder to change things. So one of the things that, you know, working with Otto has been incredible. They have this, she has this amazing vision for this project. And we're like, well, where do we get that journalism piece in if it changes? And it's like, well, this part can change easily. So we're being educated. This part of the interactive can change. This part, you really need to be sure of your journalism, because I'm going to lock in those words, because in this case, you saw one of the slides, she's going to create a stream of light, right? That's actually really complex to have a moving stream of light. I don't know how she does that, by the way. She can talk about that. She's much more articulate. But the point is, the words that are going to be in that stream have to be vetted. That is really important for Frontline, right? If our brand means anything, it's vetted journalism, right? So we could be in any form, but you better have the journalism locked down. So even that, Asya, is like, that's the premise of this project. The premise of the project is only going to become clear when the investigative journalism is locked down, right? So it was a little bit like one of these situations in which we need to know what our outcome is before you can even create that important, hopefully impactful stream of light. Like, what's the premise of the whole project? So that's why, I mean, working with her has been incredible because she loves journalism, right? She wouldn't call herself a journalist, but she's a truth teller. But she's like, yeah, so she's explaining to us, you can move this around, you can't move that around. So I'm not going to build that until you know what your words are. So that's very different than filmmaking, right? Filmmaking in a linear edit suite, you can change words up until, you know, Frontlines have been open. I'm telling you the truth here. Like, we have actually live, you know, broadcast our films. We did it just a couple of weeks ago, where we're working up until the Tuesday of air being streaming, and we're able to change things as we're going right up until the moment it's seen by the public. It's very different in interactive work.
Yeah, thank you for that. It also makes me think that while in a linear documentary, the process itself can become a part of the film. You can document the process. It's much harder to do that in interactive.
So true. That is a really good point. I never thought about that before, but like we have a documentary that's coming out in December, and it's all about the process of journalism around this one really tricky investigation. Well, you know what that's like in your film. And that was the heart of your film ultimately, right? Maybe it isn't how you started to think about it, but that was the most amazing part. Very hard to do that in interactive work. And that would be a great innovation if you guys can figure that out. And maybe Kat, you have some ideas, because that would really like bring us forward as journalists.
I don't know if I have any ideas, but I do think maybe social media does that better than we do.
Yeah.
And, you know, going back to your son's question, you know, why can't Frontline be more like Minecraft? Why can't it be something? I don't mean Frontline. I mean all that we do. Why can't it be built while we're telling it? Right. And so that remains a really big question around this, you know, highly shareable, highly collective experience of interactive work. And I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment, but
I think for us, you know, we're an edited news organization, right? So editors are the decision makers. So we've been really working on like how do you bring you know, the audience into our experience. It's really complex, right? Because you trust Frontline because of the process we go through, but then we really want to bring our audiences closer to our work and more immersed in our work. So I don't think I'm ever going to have the answer to this, but I do think it's a worthy exploration for journalism in the future. And I'm starting to understand your idea and Sarah's idea a lot more on this, the idea of co-creating, and that idea now makes more sense to me multiple years in, because I think, you know, whether it makes sense for Frontline is another question, but it's something that I'm exploring and thinking deeply about.
Yeah, also we talk about prototyping, right? And putting things out there before they're finished as part of the process and showing that.
Well, I mean, the process piece and having advisors, that's something that we have been doing. So we have been bringing people into our process more than we ever have before. That's in part why we have Dawn Porter. You know, I mean, she's a lawyer. Not only is she a lawyer, she's a filmmaker. She's Black, and her experience is one that I wanted to really center Black creative thinkers and journalists on this project and many others. I feel very strongly about that. But then on the other hand, what she's bringing are all the journalism questions right at the heart of that. And then the question is, do you publish before you have the answers, you know, to get feedback? And then in some cases, you know, in investigative work, and Dawn and I talk a lot about this, in some cases that's libelous, right? So the work that we do, the investigative work we do is a special kind of journalism, right? So do you go out in the world before you have the people to hold account? In this case, it would be the FBI and the Department of Justice. Did they drop the ball? Do we have enough evidence? You know, it's really like complex to go out there before you have that, but you want to, right? So this is something we're also thinking deeply about.
Nadav, you had a question?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing all this incredible work to dig into later, to And I wanted to connect a couple of threads, both what Halsey was asking and even what you were talking about prototyping now. I'm wondering if in this kind of spirit of prototyping and of venturing into more kind of physical media, like you were talking about installations, you're also thinking of, and this idea of public media kind of reclaiming innovation, you know, the actual tools through which people experience have these experiences, right? I mean, we know from Nani Del Pina's example, right, that out of her projects in part, like Oculus came out, right? But then it became this totally commercial, very, very, you know, now Facebookized too, right? But it's kind of like oriented towards a very particular ends, right? So I'm kind of curious if you're thinking of giving a space or working with people that also prototype or experiment with hardware, right? With kind of ways of
You would love that.
experiences, right?
Yeah, and we have actually done some collaborations in that regard, but I mean, to be honest with you, of course we would, right? I think I will tell you in the 360 space that Facebook, we did work with Facebook for a number of years, and we did, you know, I would say probably, I don't want to quote the number, but a multitude of them. And then, you know, it's complex now as a news organization to be in collaboration with Facebook monetarily, but, you know, we still have a good audience relationship with them. But a content relationship is something that we've talked, you know, a lot with them about. On the Oculus side, for example, you know, if a company like Oculus wanted to fund a nonprofit news organization like Frontline and actually fund investigative journalism in their space, of course we would. Right, it would be terrific and it would be welcome. I think the question is that big enough for them? Are they going to get the kind of audience that they need, right, to make it worth their while? And can we evangelize this work enough so that they believe that it's worthwhile? And I think probably we could, and it would be helpful to. So yes, the answer is yes.
So we have some questions from the audience that I'm going to turn to now. This one from Amy Maxman. She says, I would love to hear how you use the Knight grant, as in, does the money go to freelance videographers, to interactive web designer companies, or freelancers?
Yeah, great question. So we do both. We do have an innovation team on the staff of Frontline, which I'm really proud of having, actually, because actually Frontline historically, this is something we're changing with DEI really at the centerpiece of what I'm trying to do with our producing core, is giving people staff jobs as opposed to hiring people freelance. The reason, and I'll speak more from the linear film side first, the reason for this is that one of the structural challenges I realized right when I took over Frontline was we were hiring the same people over and over again, in part because they were independent and they were able to support their production companies. And so it was almost like expedient. You know, you could just hire the same people, which is also a good thing, right? They're reliable, they're journalists, but it also meant that we were primarily hiring white men. And so I really did a shift towards saying, how can we actually change the culture of Frontline through and through? So this is an addition and of course because of innovation, but really change Frontline. And we then started to fundraise, which is really my biggest emphasis on giving people actual jobs. So not just hiring freelancers. And so we've increased the staff of Frontline, I think something like a third since I've taken over, and diversified in the process of that, both in terms of what the stories that we tell, like the podcast team are staffers, the innovation team are staffers. Now they're small staffs, like 3 or 4 people on a team, but this is how change happens, right? And that's something that, you know, also in the interactive space, we found like we would work with companies that were also primarily white and primarily male. And so we really wanted to hire our own people that we would then help mentor and get them educated, right? So somebody in the space of innovation that can grow with Frontline. And that's something that we do a lot. But that doesn't mean that we don't then collaborate with and work with outside companies to help us realize our vision. That's necessary because we can't do it all of ourselves. But my vision is that we just, you know, increasingly hire people on the staff of Frontline and give them jobs that are worthwhile.
Great. So here's a question from Alette Schoon. What should we be teaching journalism students about immersive storytelling?
Well, I think students will be teaching us, this is my experience, to be really honest. I think that, you know, I mean, my children have taught me a lot more than my linear staff have taught me, or we could teach them. But in all seriousness, I think embracing that this is part of the future of storytelling is the key, and not thinking that it's not going to be. It is. It's already here, right? You can see it in how teenagers are immersed in gaming. So increasingly, people are going to want to be in an immersive space. I don't think this is going away. In fact, I think it's just going to only increase. And the question then is, how does journalism translate into this space? And I'm pretty sure if we collaborated with young students on this and there was funding for it, that we would be surprised at what they would come up with. I don't really know about a curriculum yet, but I know you all could teach, right? But I think being open to what they want to make is the key. And that's also like one of the biggest, you know, takeaways for me in this space is giving people the license to show us what they want to make. And somebody like Tamara, who has a vision for how she wants to create the list of the people in the list. Like I said, there's no way that I could have come up with that idea. That's just her, right? That's how her mind thinks and what she wanted to do. And she brought that to the table, right? So I think it should be part of the curriculum, and then they should be given freedom to help us create this.
Yeah, and a related question from Susan Cardillo, and maybe this is already answered, but where do I begin in teaching all of this? Where would you begin if you had to teach a course in this?
Call Sarah and William. I don't think I'm one person, but I mean, actually, like my education started with you guys. So I think, you know, you guys have one of the best websites for interactive storytelling that there is. And for me, you know, obviously at Frontline, we're making these efforts, but I think for students, immersing themselves in it is the most important thing. And, you know, we would say this about filmmaking too. Like a young filmmaker on the linear side would ask me, how do I become a filmmaker? And I would say, well, you have to decide what kind of film you want to make. So you have to watch and think and dream. What kind of story do you want to tell? How do you want to tell it? What kind of story is the best form for what you want to tell? And sometimes that can change, right? But knowing what's out there is really helpful. And that's why the year I had actually at MIT was everything, because it gave me time to just get up to speed, frankly, because I wasn't up to speed. I was, and now I could do that again, by the way. I could take another year at this point in my career and actually immerse myself again in what has happened in the community at large to then take us to the next level. But the great news is, because I have a team of people doing that, and somebody like, you know, the Auto team, they're bringing it to us. But even somebody like me who studied this needs to study again. So I think it's almost a lifelong pursuit here.
So a question from Alette Schoon again. What technology and platforms do you use now that Flash is dead?
I'll have to get back to you on that. Yeah, that's a big problem for us. Yeah.
And then one from Julian Plowden. And also, I don't know if any of the fellows want to answer that question. Sure, so people. No. Okay. What could journalism be gamified, possibly through VR?
Yeah, I mean,
Julian Plowden.
I think so. You know, I think you know, one of the things that we felt is like this idea that you would have choices through the experience of journalism. I think Last Generation is not a game, but it would maybe be the beginning of a game. And if we had more time, you know, climate change is such a changing journalism space. Like to Halsey's point, you know, it's not only like the technology gets older, but also the journalism does. So what we've struggled with is, especially in the current affairs journalism space, so not in an investigative journalism space, it's hard to make something like that takes another year to make into a game. So gaming takes time too. So then by then it's like, are you doing different journalism in that space? So I would be like very excited to see something that was, you know, was gamified in our space. We certainly see great experiments in that area, and that's really great. Like, you know, and I think that that's something that Frontline always wanted to do, but we just haven't quite figured out something synergistic yet. But we're looking. We think it would be a great space to be in. And I think that even more after the pandemic. I'm even more convinced that, you know, my son's question and questions of how are we connecting to younger generations could be through gaming. And I don't have that answer, but I'm sure there is a better one out there.
Great. So a question from Patricia Zimmerman. Might you elaborate more on the standards of evidence and explanation brought to these 360 videos and interactive projects? What is similar to the analog documentaries and what is different or more challenging?
Well, I think the biggest thing for us is information. So it's how do you get information? This was my biggest challenge. So in an analog situation, and I would just say linear, like a linear film, a documentary, you can actually embed a lot of information in that. And we're pretty expert at how to do that at this point, right? In an interactive experience that's web-based, you can also embed a lot of intelligence in there. You can have additional links and pages and a way to experience it that's multi-layered. In a VR experience, and it's one of the actually like the impediments to doing serious investigative journalism that we could see, is that you can't put too much information in that space, right? So just to speak in kind of a 30,000 foot way and not a technical way, for us on the Greenland melting story, you know, we were just showing you, right? We're showing you the change. We're visualizing that for you so you can be immersed in that change. But then there's the whole story about how that change happened. And also, by the way, who's accountable for that change, which governments, which corporations, that you couldn't get into in that space that we did in writing, right? So I feel like it's not the perfect space sometimes for deep investigative work, but more like an immersive space. But, you know, one of the challenges for us is like, you know, Frontline isn't a brand where you would go dancing or rather swimming with the dolphins, right? Like you wouldn't just swim in an immersive space with dolphins for Frontline. That's just not the space we're operating in. We're operating in an investigative accountability space. So how do you take those big questions and then hold somebody in an aggressive interview? Like, I want to hold, you know, the head of Exxon to account. How do you do that in an interactive? You can. But in a VR space is complex. So this is something that, you know, we thought a lot about, you know, and we're right at the beginning of this journey in terms of VR. And so maybe the next one that we do will crack that code a little bit more. So it's not only an immersive space where you experience climate change, but you hold those to account, because that's really part of, you know, that's what drives me as a journalist. So I hope that's helpful. It was kind of a roundabout way of answering it in my way.
Yeah, and to this question, and you know, sort of asking it in a different way, could you discuss the issues of telling while sharing narrative control? So like that agency versus sitting back, lean back.
Yeah, I mean, so again, like we're journalists with editorial perspective. So everything that you see on Frontline has gone through a process, journalism vetting process. You either like that or you don't, right? That's the way Frontline is right now. So I'll give you an example. It's like, you know, even a scene that you see in a Frontline film, we've looked at the rushes of that scene to make sure nothing was edited out of context. That's really important. We have a whole transparency project that's all about giving you access to our archive of interviews. So we kind of have this perspective of like, you can question our journalism choices, but then at the end of the day, we are making choices. We just want to be transparent about how we've made those choices. The question of how we then have an audience member or somebody watching us or experiencing us, then have agency to either change the narrative, right? Well, they could with our transparency project or challenge us or experience it themselves, like in Minecraft, right? They're actually building something, is something that we are thinking deeply about right now. I do think by virtue of changing the people who tell our stories, the communities that we're embedded in, the way that we're telling stories might open us up to different ways to think about this. I mean, even if you think about, I'll go back to Forsama just because we mentioned it earlier. You know, the idea that a filmmaker would immerse herself for 5 years and film 500 hours of her life, and then we would make a film out of it. You know, one of the challenges that we now want to say is like, well, what about those 500 hours? Like, should we give that to the public? So part of me feels like our journalism gathering, that's a public property as well as the edited version. And that's where I think what we're doing is kind of radical, actually. We're saying we are an edited series, but we want you to see how we did that and to then engage with us. And you can share that, and then you can counter that, and you can comment on that. But it's a little bit of a different way of thinking about interacting with our journalism.
So we have a question here from Julian Plowden. How can students stay in contact with Frontline if they have immersive journalism ideas, e.g. magical school bus, civil rights, time travel stories?
Yeah, you can write us. You can email me. Yeah, we're pretty reachable. We have this really interesting idea at Frontline that every single email and letter gets answered. It doesn't mean you get a film or a project, but actually I wrote a cold letter to Frontline. So this is where the bias comes from, people who walk through the door completely without connections. And I wrote a letter to Frontline, an actual letter, because it was like 20 years ago. And it went in the mail to the story editor of Frontline, and she called me. And so that was the beginning of my relationship to Frontline. She just decided to call me off of like a completely cold letter. And so we answer every single pitch that's sent us, and we have an open door to ideas. And we've gotten a couple of amazing ideas in the last few years that way.
So a question from Gilad Thaler regarding the diversity of employees you work with and creating opportunities to work at Frontline. Can you elaborate on the Filmmaker in Residence program?
Oh yeah, so I'll start with the Filmmaker in Residence program. Is something that was funded a couple of years ago, and it allows for 2 filmmakers a year to be essentially, it's really like a staff job. It's just a fancy way of saying that you are a producer for Frontline, but you're on staff. And it's been one of the most effective tools to diversify our producers. Again, with the idea being that, we really want Frontline to be told by a multitude of Americans. We want it to look and feel like America, as opposed to, what Frontline was in the past. And to actively change our structure, we've been offering jobs like that. And in terms of our staff makeup, we actually are transparent about that too. We publish our diversity numbers and the makeup of our staff. It's called Frontline by the Numbers, and it's on our website. And so you can read all about us and read about our ethos behind the work we've been doing in that regard. We were really fortunate, again, back to funding, we were fortunate to receive a Build grant from the Ford Foundation 4 years ago, and the entire staff decided that diversity was one of the top 3 issues for Frontline to face and to be better at. I think we're just beginning, but we're now 3 or 4 serious years in, and a lot of changes occurred. We just have a long way to go, but you can see all of that and read about it and ask me any questions about that as well. I don't think a lot of people publish their diversity numbers, but that's another thing that I evangelize, because I think the more that we publish who we are, the more you're held to account, but also it's a good way to dialogue with people in public more transparently. Oh, so by the way, I got the technical answer on the platform, guys. I asked somebody, because I'm a multitasker, and what they told me is, yeah, Flash, that's really hard. The Flash went away. That's a really big disappointment. She wrote me like 4 texts about that. But she said that they built a CMS, content management system, using a Google Doc, and it's open source. So we can share any and all of that. So that's a pretty good workaround. So anything that you guys need on the open source side, we publish all of that so people can use that as well.
WordPress. There are no more questions in here. I don't know if any fellows have any questions. I'll ask a question in the meantime. You talked about, how excited you are of how much of this goes into schools. And I was wondering, in your contact with schools, are you seeing any inkling that VR might be something that goes into school, whether it's web VR or, immersive platforms where stories can be told?
Yeah, I know there's a big interest in it. I think it's a funding issue. So what we did with actually Greenland Melting is we put it in the schools that are local here in Boston. We put them in 3 different schools. And we traveled with it into the schools to watch 6th and 7th graders use it who are in their science classes. In order to support that it actually taught me a lot about the impediment to working with schools in forms that aren't built into the curriculum. So this would be like an additive to the curriculum. This is about public school. Private schools, we don't have a relationship with, but on the public school side where they're following a set curriculum, just getting them to free up 2 or 3 hours in a week, in a year in advance was like, well, people are nodding because it's actually quite a big thing to do. So we were able to do it in a bunch of schools by our sheer passion, but it was quite difficult. What was much easier was Last Generation, because that was then assigned to the students. So that's not VR. And again, it's a web-based interactive experience. Then they could assign it so that they could watch it at home, discuss it in school, like watch, experience, you know, and do all of the cool things you can do in that interactive. But VR it's really hard because it's one student at a time, right? And so we would go into schools with 3 or 4 headsets, and I did this once myself with my team. Actually, I did it 2 or 3 times. And it was like actually quite a big thing to pull off. Like kids were coming in, you know, it was really cumbersome. It taught me a lot. You know, it's like a film festival when people are lining up to see the experience. We saw it at MIT a bunch of times, right? But it's still worth it. But whether or not it's going to become like a systematized thing across the board educationally, I don't know. I hope so.
Josh?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for giving so much of that sort of backstory about sort of innovations at Frontline. I'm curious if a lot of the innovations for interactive are having a kind of impact on linear, on long form sort of legacy documentary. I know you talked a little bit about the form. And I mean, do you envision a kind of point where the interactive project is going to be this sort of tent pole, you know, out of which the linear film emerges, or a theatrical release, you know, Frontline documentary comes? And and I know you were talking a little bit about this before the session, but if you could elaborate on that process.
That's the most, thank you for asking that. That's the most exciting thing that I've seen in the last year, is that we started with Unresolved. Was originally going to, they hoped it would be a documentary series. We then said, oh no, we think it should be an interactive. So 151 cases are investigated and actually put in the public, right? We wanted to put all of the unresolved cases in the public. But now the interesting question that we're getting from both funders, but also filmmakers and the team itself is, like, what about a film out of this experience? So in what we're finding is, like, which are the cases that we think would be the most powerful, and honestly, in Frontline's lens, that hold the government the most account, right? So we do think out of Unresolved, likely there will be a documentary series. So that would be the first time that's happened, but it won't be the last, because what a remarkable experience that we've had with it. And it's helped us see a way forward for the linear films. And I would say in general for Frontline, the interactive and innovation work is helping us, I believe, in ways that are a little bit hard to measure. I believe that, you know, we're telling stories in a much more immersive way, just even in linear film. We're letting people that might not have held the narrative hold the narrative, right? And I think that's kind of the key to even the work that we just did on with Jelani Cobb on policing, right? We're allowing for those conversations to happen in a way that in film terms, we might have made shorter, right? We might have had the narrative click on, we might have had more narration. We're allowing for those conversations, and we're learning about that in the interactive space, because this is storytelling, right? Across forums, and we're all working together. So when we learn something, it easily translates into the film that's coming up, because it's not like Frontline is like 500 people. We're like literally like 30 people. So we're all teaching each other things. And so it's pretty remarkable. I think it's impacting us in ways that, you know, we don't even know, you know, and our tastes are changing. And I think, you know, we're all just people. So as we learn more and we tell more stories in an immersive way, we want that kind of immediacy in our films. And we want new filmmakers as a consequence, you know, people to tell those stories in a way that, you know, perhaps we wouldn't have in the past.
All right. Well, thank you, Raney. This has been a really
Fellows, yeah.
inspiring and informational. And I remember you as a fellow, you were always asking questions, question upon question. And I think that's what this is about too. And just when you're working with the unknown and new forms, you just keep on asking those questions. So, and thank you to all the fellows, and thank you to the audience and for being here today. And join us next week when we have Heather Mayo Smith, who is a experienced designer and the maker of a product called Storyfile. So thank you, everyone. See you next week. And thank you, Raney. That was terrific.